Welcome to seminar. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest today. Josh Carlson is Associate Professor in the Department of Pharmacy at the University of Washington School of Pharmacy. He's also an investigator in the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. Josh is known to some of us who either some way affiliated with the University of Washington. He got his bachelor's from University of Colorado at Boulder. That was before they had the pot thing, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay. But now that's good in Washington, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's nice. And he's got a master's in genetics and also in PhD in public health genetics. And then he did a postdoc in pharmacoeconomics with David Feenstra at University of Washington. And David Feenstra does kind of the intersection between pharmacogenomics and pharmacoeconomics. So Josh is now associate professor. His research is in comparative effectiveness, the value of information in health technology, and pharmacoeconomics and decision models. He's the PI for the ICER project, which, as you know, we have also here at UIC, and there's three sites in the country: Colorado, University of Washington, and UIC. He's also the winner of the ISPOR Bernie O'Brien New Investigator Award in 2014. And so today he's talking about outcomes-based contracting, and Washington's been doing a lot of work in this area and has a big database where they try to keep track of these things. So welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
So I recognize some of you from your trip out to Seattle, so hello again. Hey there. And so this, as you're saying, I got my PhD in the public health genetics program, and so basically started off, and it was at the time when the Human Genome Project was a big issue, and this was a program that was developed to try and think about how advances that were coming from that type of research could be brought to bear on public health goals. So we did a lot of talk about social issues like stigma and ethical issues and legal issues around that, and we had really good conversations, but I couldn't figure out what I was going to do with all that information when I grew up. So I started getting into pharmacogenomics, and a person who was teaching in our health outcomes group at the University of Washington there, David Feenstra, was doing stuff in pharmacogenomics, which was a nice mix of some of that work, and I got introduced to the outcomes group there, and then did my dissertation in pharmacogenomics and a cost-effectiveness model of testing for EGFR status in non-small cell lung cancer, stuff like that. And then when I was done with my PhD, I decided to do a postdoc, and I didn't want to do anything having to do with genetics because I've been talking about genetics for 5 years or whatever it was. And so this opportunity came up. We have a corporate advisory board, which is a group of all sort of the big names in the industry that you might think. And they have a mechanism, or we have a mechanism, whereby they will put some money together to do research in an area that's mutually of interest, but not about any one drug or one company. And so at the time, this was back in 2007, this was a topic that came up. There were just some initial agreements that were out in the atmosphere, I guess. And so we did some initial work, and we created a taxonomy to try and get some common language around it. And we did a systematic review of agreements in this space. And then we turned that into a database. And so we've maintained that database over time. And I've given any number of talks on this topic over the last 10 years. But it's continued to be relevant. And so it's relevant, especially now in the US, whereas when we first started, it was more relevant in Europe and in other places. So I was joking. This is a little bit like when, an artist has a top hit and then they're asked to play that song every single time they have to sing in a concert. But this is also, a topical one and one that I know a fair amount about. So I usually like to keep these, especially in seminars, a little informal. So please, if anybody has questions, just go ahead and ask, and we'll take those. So try to start with this one. It's basically kind of gets at the reason why outcomes agreements exist and some of the motivation for that. And so basically, the customer really doesn't want a drilling machine, he wants a hole in the wall. So it doesn't matter how you get to that, what the intervention is. What's most important to patients and what's most important to often people paying for that is the result of that work. And so if you're not getting the hole in wall, you don't really want to pay for the drill. And so this is sort of underscores the initial motivation and what underlies this field in general. There are a lot of names that people throw out when they talk about these types of agreements. I list some here. Maybe some of you guys have heard of some of these. Some of them are direct overlaps to the idea of performance-based risk-sharing arrangements, which is the long term that we came up with when we were first working on this. Some of them are a lot easier to say, like outcomes-based schemes or managed entry agreements. There's a pretty high degree of overlap. The performance-based risk-sharing arrangements, as we define it, as you'll see, is the big, kind of a really big category, and it covers not only sort of the outcomes guarantee space, where most of the issues are right now, but also some other areas like coverage with evidence development, which is on here. That's something that CMS does and some other groups do. And so I just put this up there because a lot of times people use a lot of different terminology. A lot of it means pretty much very similar stuff. So for example, patient access schemes is the term that they use in the UK, but not too much other places. So the slides may be a little wonky because we're going from a Mac to a PC environment. So apologies for that. But this is kind of a little bit about what some of the primary drivers for these are. And so one is just increasing medical expenditures. We're all pretty well aware that healthcare costs continue to rise, and pharmaceutical costs as a share continue to rise as well. So there's a lot of motivation among payers, especially to try and keep control of costs. And the other one is just the pervasiveness of uncertainty when products enter the market. There's a lot of sources of uncertainty that I list here. Primary among those with regards to this type of thing is the transition from efficacy to effectiveness. Classically, contracts are based on efficacy data, what we see in trials, and then but when you get to the effectiveness place, you don't really know, you don't have information on how the actual patients in a healthcare plan are going to do with that drug. It's based on these very clinical trial environments, which are just not the same as being in the real world environment. So these are two kind of primary drivers that we sort of theorized were underscoring the motivation to develop these types of agreements. Okay, try that. And so payers would respond with a number of mechanisms to try and control costs. I list them here. I'm sure you guys are pretty familiar with these. And these are basically the ways that they try and keep costs down or restrict the populations over time. Now it's going automatically. So to sort of set the stage a little bit, you can think about what historically the risk sharing or the shared risk was between manufacturers and payers. So historically, manufacturers took a lot of upfront risk. So it's risky to develop drugs. They can be very expensive to develop, and they don't always pay off. So they're taking up a lot of upfront risk. Once they're sort of on market, they've made it through the FDA. They could be at risk for payers not restricting access or limiting access. But most of their risk is up front, right? And then payers, their risk is now, once it's on the market and they're purchasing it, so payers and patients bear the risk that it's a bad buy. It actually doesn't deliver what you thought it was going to deliver. So their risk is in making a bad purchase and not having sort of the value that you thought you were going to get. And then just to note also that, these types of environments and this risk equilibrium is different in different countries depending on the structure that they have for how they pay for pharmaceuticals. So being in a free pricing environment versus a controlled pricing environment, the risk differs depending on the situation. But we came to define risk-sharing agreements as arrangements between a payer and a pharmaceutical device or diagnostic manufacturer. So these aren't just limited to pharmaceuticals, where most of the action is, but these exist for diagnostics and devices as well. And so it's where the price level or the nature of reimbursement is related to the actual future performance of the product in either the research or the real world. So tried to cover a lot of ground. The key element here is that it is about the future performance of a product. So historically, the negotiation happened based on all the evidence we had looking backwards. Now there's basically a point where we're saying we're going to have the nature of a reimbursement, so whether a product is covered or not, or the amount of money, the reimbursement level, tied to actually how patients do moving forward. We're going to track those patients, and it's going to be linked to the nature of reimbursement. That's the big difference between these agreements and sort of historically what those agreements were like. And so here's 5 key characteristics. This work came from the ISPOR task force that Lou Garrison led, which was from our group. Basically, there's a program of data collection. That means we're following patients and we're collecting data. It's typically initiated at the time of regulatory approval. So when a product is entering the market, that's when we typically see these types of agreements coming about. This is the price, reimbursement, or revenue is linked to the outcome of this data collection. That's that explicit link between the data collection and the nature of reimbursement. Typically, it's collected to address an uncertainty, specific type of uncertainty. And the idea here, this is why they were originally called risk-sharing agreements, is the arrangement provides a different distribution of risk after the contract is in place. Now, they were typically called risk-sharing, and that sounds like both parties would share in the risk, and there was maybe upside and downside risk. Typically, the risk is shifting. It's more like a risk shifting from the payer to the manufacturer. So there's sort of a lot of, prices go down. They don't typically get more if their drugs do better. There are a couple examples out there where they're beginning to do that, but most of the risk is basically shifting from the payer to the manufacturer. And so,
Could I
yeah.
just qualify your statement about based on some kind of rule? Is the rule typically outcomes based, like a certain percentage of patients, or each patient will reach a certain outcome, live a certain length of time, or have a certain level of quality of life, or a combination of each one?
So for any agreement, it's a contract, and any of those things can actually theoretically be used. Typically, what's used, there's a measure of benefit or a measure of, if it's a clinical-based one, there's some measure that's important to patients, but it has to be within sort of a relevant time frame. So these agreements, because they're talking about health plans, are usually on the 1 to 2 year time frame. And so if what's most important is overall survival, and that's going to be 10 years down the line, it doesn't find its way into these contracts. So typically we see the measures as described being stuff that's more short-term. So for example, in diabetes, it's A1C values, it's not sort of long-term sequelae. I'm not sure if that's answering what your question is.
And I'm sure you're going to tell us more about some of these things in a moment, so thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to jump in and just do one example so people get a little bit of a sense of what these specifically look like. I have more examples at the end. If we have time, we can get to those. But so here's an example, and this was one of the first ones that got a lot of notoriety in 2007. It's part of the reason we started this work. This was stuff coming out of the UK, and there was a product called Velcade, which is used, or bortezomib, which is used to treat multiple myeloma. And when it was launched, it was basically had one single phase 3 trial. There were surrogate endpoints. The trial was stopped early because it did well, which is good for trying to get FDA approval or to show some efficacy, but it's not necessarily great in terms of uncertainty. You're collecting less data. You have a little bit more uncertainty around that. And there was limited data on overall survival. It was high cost with a variable treatment duration because it's always treat to progression in this setting. And it wasn't cost effective when they first submitted it to NICE. So NICE has a pretty strong bar. If you're above that, they're not going to allow you to get access to patients. It was a first-in-class drug. There weren't a lot of good alternatives, but basically it was denied when it was first when the NHS first considered it, or NICE first considered it. So they developed one of the first risk-sharing agreements, or patient access schemes as they call it, and they resubmitted this to NICE. And what they did was they implemented a stopping rule after 4 cycles. So patients would receive bortezomib, they would get 4 cycles of treatment, and then they would be evaluated to see whether they were responding to treatment or not. And they had a specific clinically valid response measure that they were using, which was a 50% decrease in serum M protein, which is a clinically valid one. And if patients were responding, they could continue to receive treatment. They got another 4 cycles, typical. If they weren't responding, they stopped treatment, and there was a refund for all the drug that was used for those patients for those first 4 cycles. So essentially, it was an outcomes guarantee. They were guaranteeing that patients were going to respond after 4 cycles, and if they didn't, there was money back to the UK. And so this was one of the first ones we saw. And after, when they basically modeled this new stopping rule and the refund, the ICER dropped, uncertainty dropped, right? Because their key thing is uncertainty around value, okay? And it was approved by NICE. And so this example is one that is often held up. Yeah.
So when calculating the ICER in this situation, is it based on those who responded only, or is it based on the entire population?
In terms of the outcomes.
Yeah, because they're only paying for those who receive benefit.
Yeah.
Is the ICER based on those?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I didn't see the model, so I don't know, because in the trial they wouldn't have stopped people who didn't respond at 4 cycles. They probably continue to get treatment and perhaps receive some benefit, right? Yeah, so it's the money saving is what they did, but they wouldn't necessarily been able to model the stopping of treatment aspect of it, right? So it's a good point, especially because there was some negotiation over the response measure. So a 50% drop in serum M protein, you can choose a different level, and so if you have a 45% drop or something like that, you still had some benefit, but you're not going to get continued treatment. So there's maybe still a little benefit left on the table there. So it's a good question. I'm not sure how they originally modeled it. But when I kind of give this an example, it sounds a little bit straightforward, but this is sort of a diagram of what the actual scheme looks like to implement. And it's rather involved, as this would say. So basically you have the customer, they order it, there's an evaluation, then they have to basically make a claim to the company and send all this data over there, and they have these limits on, basically you have like 10 weeks to send it over. If you don't, then you don't get a rebate. There's all these sort of things in place that make it a little bit difficult. But basically, they have to go through this complicated scheme. Alien question.
Somebody on the call is making weird ass noises. Maybe you guys could mute your phones so that we don't hear whatever you're doing. That sounds illicit. Thank you. But you're apparently not listening because we can still hear you. I don't know if there's a way to
Force mute everyone.
Todd?
I want to watch you do this. This will be fun.
He's going to laugh at me either way. So.
The call.
Open a tape.
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Who was it?
I don't know. I would guess Shant.
It was Sham.
Gotta be Shant.
All right. So here's a slide that gets a little bit at some of the motivations for people. And so this is, some groups did a survey where they asked manufacturers and payers about the motivation that they thought existed for either manufacturers or payers. So this is the reason that manufacturers went into these agreements, reported by manufacturers themselves or by payers. So this is what manufacturers said that they did it, and this is what payers thought about why manufacturers did it, if that makes sense. And there's some decent alignment. So basically, top is basically getting access, and that makes sense. The manufacturers are willing to play because they just want access. They want to get rid of restrictions, and they want access to patients. There are a number of other things they list here, but that's certainly the key one. There's some stuff around reduction in uncertainty, and then things like internal or external goal, which doesn't really make sense. But the other one to note is basically there's also a gain in competitive advantage. and there can be gains to competitive advantage. And you'll see with some of these agreements, they will give a refund if they get better formulary placement, for example. So that's kind of what they're trying to get. So it's not just access, it's also they can use it to get better positioning on a formulary. And you'll often see that type of thing. So they're willing to give up some money in terms of per patient as long as they get a little increase in volume, right? And they can kind of justify it in that way. And then here's the same graph, but flipped. So this is the motivation for payers as described by payers, and then as described by manufacturers here. And the top one that they state here is the reduction in costs, which makes sense. That's kind of what we would think. So increasing the rebate, which is related to that, and then reducing financial risk. So again, this is about that risk shifting risk. And then they also have something down here which is not the risk, which is also improving patient outcomes. So in a dynamic environment, if you're essentially rewarding the delivery of good outcomes, that hopefully will lead to better outcomes for patients, right? So that's more of a long-term goal, but it's certainly part of sort of the general incentives for this type of agreement. Okay, so that's kind of just trying to get a sense of what this is and some of the motivation for this area. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the terms that we use in this area, and then we'll look at the U.S. Market a little bit specific and some of the challenges that we face. So basically, like I said, we've been doing this work for a while, trying to just capture all of these types of agreements, and we basically look at published literature, gray literature, press releases. If some guy at a conference says anything, we try and grab it. There's not a lot of real high quality peer-reviewed journal articles that list these types of agreements. So we get the information where we can get it. And in the U.S., there's especially a lack of transparency. In Europe, a lot of times government bodies, because they're the payer of interest, will list this type of information. We can grab some of it. Although that has even changed over time because manufacturers don't necessarily want their rebates or these price adjustments listed. So they've gone to lengths to try and create that level of or lack of transparency. So this is a taxonomy that we developed when we first started working in this space. And it's held up pretty well. There's a number of other taxonomies that are out there, and I'm just going to cover the key pieces here. The key distinction we originally made was these are types of agreements that were based on actual health outcomes. So measuring how patients function and feel and how long they live, actual health outcomes, versus ones that were just based on financial things or utilization, the number of pills people take, that type of a thing. So we made that initial distinction. And then over here, we focused on two areas. Conditional coverage, so this is stuff that only has to do with whether a product is actually covered or not how much money changes hands, not the price. It's just, can patients get it or not? And so under that, we have coverage with evidence development, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And also this thing called conditional treatment continuation, and I will talk about that as well. Then over here, we have performance-linked reimbursement. This is the area that people typically call an outcomes guarantee. And this is where we have an explicit link to the reimbursement level, the amount of money that's changing hands. That's that one over there. So I'll just dive into each of those, starting with this. Coverage with evidence development is where coverage is conditioned on collecting more evidence. There's two varieties. One is only in research. That means that only patients who are participating in research, they're in a trial, they're in a registry, they get covered. Everybody else does not get covered. Okay? CMS has a large program where they have these agreements. They're listed on their website. They're in a lot of different areas, but basically they designate what constitutes the research that they will basically under which they will cover patients. And then if patients are actually participating in that, they will pay for that patient, and if they're not, they won't. The other variety is called only with research. This is where there's an agreement to conduct additional research between the manufacturer and the payer. But in the interim, they will make that product available to everybody. So the example here is out of France. So France's Ministry of Health agreed to cover risperidone, if J&J performs studies to evaluate whether it helps patients stay on their other medication. So the manufacturers of risperidone made claims that patients were more adherent on their other medications. France didn't believe them just right out of the block. They said, fine, we think that might be true. We want you to conduct a study that looks like this. But we're going to let people have that drug in the interim. But in 2 years, you have to come back with the study results. And we're going to look at this again. And we'll basically decide if we're going to continue coverage or not. This is only about that coverage issue or not. And some countries have this mechanism in place almost hands down. So Sweden, for example, for most new drugs where there's some sort of uncertainty, they will have a 3-year period. They will outline a few topics that they want you to go and research. And if you don't come back, they will pull your drug from the market. So you have to come back in order to get that continued reimbursement.
I just have a question. Who pays for the research?
This is on the manufacturer.
Okay.
Yeah, so they require that of the manufacturer to do the research. Yeah. And so just to kind of get at what the motivations here and why they do this. So basically for some products, there's insufficient evidence at product launch and the time of the coverage decision. So essentially this creates a middle ground. So they allow some access, but they're also getting data to inform a better decision. And so the payer gets a benefit of providing access while generating additional evidence to support future coverage decision. And the manufacturer gets some access, depending on if it's only with research or only in research. It's better if you're in the only with research where everybody gets access for a period of time. But there's also the idea of reduced cost of data collection. That is to say, especially this applies to a number of devices in CMS's program. And they don't have as big a wallets as pharma might. So if they're actually getting their product covered during this data collection piece, that can reduce the cost of generating that additional data.
Josh, with the research with or in agreements, do they have to do them within the country, or can they pool data across countries to demonstrate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So so usually the only in is in the country. Only with, it depends on the type of study that you're specifically talking about. So Sweden, a lot of times they want to know how the product works in their population because so much of the data isn't in their population, right? But there are certain agreements where they will say, like for example, they've tied future coverage decisions to an ongoing clinical trial, and they'll say when that you're collecting data, when that trial finishes, we'll revisit it. So it's not explicit, but usually it's within country.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And so here's just a look at who's doing this. As I mentioned, Sweden does this quite a lot. The Netherlands did this a fair amount. They had this expensive drug medicines list where they wanted to cover stuff, and they had a special pool of funds, but they did a lot of it under the context of generating more data. And then the United States has a fair amount. Most of that, if not all of that, is from CMS. And then there's some other groups that do this type of work. The next category is called conditional treatment continuation. A little bit of a mouthful. Back at this time, I was not very good at making easy-sounding phrases to describe things, and that continues on for every presentation that I give, but it does mean something, so that's helpful. So conditional treatment continuation is basically where you have the continuation of coverage for individual patients that is conditioned upon meeting a short-term treatment goal. It's similar to a stopping rule for clinicians, but this is at the payer level. And so the example, one example here is that Alzheimer's drugs, this was in Italy, Alzheimer's drugs that were provided free by the manufacturer in Italy, and then they set up this specific treatment goals per patient, and if those treatment goals were met at 3 months, then the patient could receive additional coverage for that drug. If that treatment goal was not met, they didn't get any more drug, and it was not paid for. And that's your little diagram. You have an initiation period, you have a short-term measure of response here, and then coverage is conditioned or not. Sometimes these are coupled with outcomes agreements. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So that Velcade example has this component as part of it, right? So people got 4 cycles. They were evaluated whether they were responding or not. And then if they were responding, they could go on. So that's the conditional treatment continuation part. The outcomes guarantee is the refund for people who were not responding. So these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, the question about, you mentioned the stopping rules. Are those, the way you described it, are those treatment goals decided at the clinician and patient level on an approved list of goals?
This one was?
Yeah.
Because it's treatment goals, so they set up goals. Oftentimes it's more explicit, especially when you get into these types of contracts. So for example, with the Velcade example, it was patients who have a 50% decrease in serum and protein. That's the market.
So it can vary between units.
It definitely, yeah. So it's important to think, a lot of times, especially us, we think like a scientist, right? These are contracts. And so the two parties can come up with almost any language that they really want to, as long as they both agree to it, it's a contract. So people are held to that. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking. So it just really depends on how they defined it in the contract, and then getting the data to basically inform whether that criteria was met or not. So here, what's being addressed here is medical products are often used in inappropriate patient populations. And so if you condition continued coverage based on a short-term treatment goal, you can basically ensure that only patients who are really benefiting from a drug are the ones who stay on it. So there's a number of benefits to the payer, and again, for the manufacturer, it's access. But you can think of this is the Alzheimer's drug example, or this happens a lot in MS, where maybe for a while there aren't good treatment options, and doctors might be in a position where they want to give something, even though it's not necessarily benefiting anyone. This is a way for the payer to actually set up something that says, okay, if patients are demonstrably not benefiting, we're not necessarily going to pay for that anymore. So it does sort of limit that exposure. Yeah.
Just as a follow-up to that point, is this typically limited to approved indications, or does it also cover off-label use as long as it's within the treatment goals that are set up?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So in theory, it doesn't have to be on label, but in the US especially, everything that is done is on label, because they're very concerned about issues around off-label communications. That may be changing. There's conversations about easing stuff via the legislation, and the what's it called? Precision Medicine Act has some language in there about easing communications around off-label stuff. So it may ease over time. But right now, everything is on label in the US.
Do they then not pay for off-label, or is off-label just handled?
It's just about the measure itself has to be on label. So serum, it has to be sort of say that it improves response in patients or something like that, and then you can use response as your measure. It's not about the patients themselves. So the patient population does not have to be necessarily on label. Although usually the way that they're done, they have some pretty strict ways of defining those populations. So who's doing a lot of this? Australia has a lot of these. Italy has them oftentimes as part of these guarantees, this hybrid version where they're tracking patients, and then there's a rebate that happens if you don't respond, but then there's the other piece of it. Finally, the performance-linked reimbursement. So here's where the reimbursement level, the actual amount of money that changes hands for covered products, is tied by a formula to the measure of clinical outcomes. So it's typically in the form of rebates, refunds, or price adjustments, but mostly it's rebates and refunds because manufacturers do not want to adjust their prices for a lot of reasons. And so the example that I list here is just that Velcade example. This is a good example of an outcomes agreement. And so here's what this looks like in Italy. So it's actually set up very similar to the. So they do this for a lot of cancer drugs, this general format. They initiate with some cycles of treatment. Sometimes those are free, sometimes they're not. Typically with the outcomes agreements, they're not. So there's a covered period, there's some money that changes hands. Non-responders and responders. For responders, treatment is continued, and that's reimbursed. Non-responders, treatment is stopped. And then there's a discount or a full refund for that initial treatment period. So what's being addressed? With these, fundamentally, payers may desire more evidence to support a manufacturer's claim especially when it's first entering the market. So manufacturers come, this is the best drug in the world, it does everything for every patient that takes it, and the payer may not believe certain elements of that, and there may not be evidence to support that, right? So they may ask for more evidence. Evidence is expensive to generate. Clinical trials are really expensive to run. It's hard to do, it all costs money to actually do that data collection. And it's also lost time in the market. So that's really valuable to manufacturers. So instead of actually collecting that data, they can just guarantee an outcome. So there's uncertainty about an endpoint. The manufacturer can say, well, if you're uncertain about that, we'll guarantee that money, and we'll tie that to the actual amount of money that we give you. And so that can basically assuage some of the uncertainty, the financial risk associated with the uncertainty around a clinical endpoint or the value that they're getting. So that's one of the benefits of doing this. The other one, and this is kind of an interesting one, is so especially in Europe, they had these external reference pricing situations. So if there was a price change in the UK, there were a lot of countries that would reference price. So Bulgaria or all these countries, they would say, okay, our price is directly tied to the price in the UK. If their price goes down, our price goes down. So manufacturers wanted to be able to give a discount to the UK, but they can't do that by just lowering the list price, because then they receive all the consequences of lowering that price all throughout all the referencing countries. So this type of thing can actually be a way of giving a local discount. So, and I list the example here. So for the Velcade example, the price for Velcade was about £760 in the UK. But after the rebate for non-responders, the average price paid during that initial period drops to about £540 per vial. But the list price stays exactly the same, so they don't suffer the consequences of the external reference pricing for that market, and they're giving a local discount. And so this was one way to sort of get by or get around that external reference pricing issue, which was a big issue there. Now, and the UK has moved away from these, and one of the reasons that they've moved away from these is because they set up a mechanism to just allow confidential discounts. So people can't reference them anymore, so they just basically created a firewall. They said, okay, we'll do confidential discounts, and then we don't have to do some of these. They still do some of them, but the variety is a little bit different. And then here's just some basic benefits. So who's doing this? Italy does a lot of these. The US, there's a lot of them. We're basically second on the list. The United Kingdom has some, and then there's a smattering of other groups, and you'll see this a lot. A lot of countries are doing sort of one-offs, or they're experimenting a little bit, and then maybe it didn't go very well, and they didn't continue it. But they don't really have official programs. It's more at a provincial level or something of that nature. Yeah.
Josh, in the U.S., is it mostly in one therapeutic area? Is it mostly in cancer?
Yeah. So cancer does dominate, and that's actually throughout the world, just because high number of products, especially over the recent time frame, high cost, and actually availability of a short-term measure of effect, right? So it all kind of lines up. A lot of stuff in just specialty products too. So again, high cost stuff, and that's a real driving force, for sure.
Josh, what is the denominator for those numbers you report?
Yeah. So
is it new drug entrants, or is it old drugs on the market? Or?
Yeah. So the denominators among those we found the proportion. So the denominator was not. We didn't do like a population sample to figure out among new agreements what's the proportion that have this type of agreement, for example.
In terms of the total number of drugs on the market, though, if we're talking 40 agreements out of 4,000, or in terms of relevant, like on-patent drugs.
How many have this type of agreement?
Yeah, it's just like 1%.
I really don't have that in my head. It's across a lot of different countries. It's yeah.
I mean, over the total number of drugs approved in the U.S., it's 38. So it's 38 over
30 drugs a year.
It's very small.
Yeah, thousands and thousands.
Yeah, but it's mostly relevant to new entities, right? Like they're not going to put an agreement on some generic drug. It's going to be things that are newly entering the market. Right. That would be the relevant denominator that
so
you're
drugs that
looking
are
for.
still kind of on patent. And
amongst new drugs, how many of them have these risk-sharing agreements?
Yeah.
Hundreds.
But also in the U.S., you have just so many payers too, right? So it's just one payer, one agreement. It's not there's not a single entity. You can do that kind of stuff in the UK. We actually have done that in the UK to try and get a sense of the relative number of sort of overall approved drugs, stuff like that. I can't recall it, but it was still a low.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So in terms of the U.S. market, it's a little bit unique because again, the payer and the manufacturer have to come to agreement on these types of things. In the UK, they can just say, yeah, we're not gonna do it. That's it, and you don't have access. So they have a lot more, sort of a bigger stick in the UK. And basically where you have a single governmental payer, they can say no, and then the manufacturer has to say, well, what now? Whereas in the US, there's a lot of restrictions about what can and can't happen. Some things have to be covered, but you still have some jockeying with formulary position. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. And so this is more about finding common ground and agreements around it than it is in some other jurisdictions. And a lot of this is hidden behind secrecy and stuff like that. So as I said, we just try and find what we can. So here's the US market. So this trend line is overall cumulative, and then this is year over year. So the purple bars are year over year. And so we see some early stuff here. This does include, this is not just outcomes guarantees, so this includes sort of coverage of evidence development as well. So we sort of saw some stuff like this. This is mostly some CMS activity through here, although we do see outcomes agreements. We thought it was kind of going away, but it's jumped back up in here, and it does seem like there's a lot of enthusiasm coming through. We usually get a little bit of a lag between when we can see them all. So it's really sort of picking up a little bit more in the US. And we've done some qualitative work in this area, and there's been continued enthusiasm for it, but a lot of it's just the fact that there was enthusiasm, but they couldn't come to an agreement. They might just be coming to a few more agreements now.
Is it likely that if a manufacturer comes to an agreement with Harvard Pilgrim, they're going to try to do it with Group Health, and they're going to try to do it with Blue Cross Blue Shield, or is it just sort of a one-off time with a given payer?
Yeah, so they do try and do repeat agreements. You'll see sort of some redundancy in that. It's usually some of the common groups that are going to do that. And the ones that are set up well, there's a few smaller groups that have good data access and integrated system. Those kind of things are going to lend themselves to being able to be in these types of agreements. So we do see some redundancy and pickup of multiple agreements. So this top one's a really big one for U.S. activity. So this is the CAR-T, the new CAR-T treatments. They're close to $500,000 a year for a one-time, and that doesn't include the hospitalization component. And they've come to an agreement with CMS. And CMS can do this kind of thing only as part of their innovation, the CMMI, the Center for Innovation, where they can basically exercise a degree of regulatory freedom if they put it under the term of experimental. So that's likely the mechanism through which they're doing this. We don't have a lot of information on this yet, but there is a press release that shows what it's doing, and basically they are looking for, and they're not going to pay for patients who do not respond after 1 month of treatment. So that's a pretty big agreement there. And I think they're going to do it with the next CAR-T as well, although we'll see. But if CMS begins to do these types of agreements, and then you can imagine Medicaid or someone like that doing these types of agreements, that's going to be a pretty big shift. And one of the reasons it's going to be a big shift is because there's a lot of rules that they worry about, the manufacturers worry about when they set up these agreements, and I'll talk about those shortly. But if CMS and Medicaid begin to do them, they're going to probably there's going to require some legislative action, which might ease some of the rules around this type of stuff. So here's just some other agreements that are in place. Harvard Pilgrim has a number of them. Cigna has a number of them. This place by Priority Health has a number of them. So there's common players that do it, but there is experiment there as well. So I don't know, you probably can't see this. This is basically just some work we did trying to identify the major barriers. Yeah.
For the previous one, for the enrolled contract, they're not going to be transparent and release kind of the criteria for that algorithm that they're using.
No, unlikely.
Okay. Will there be some sort of push maybe for transparency?
So I would like to see it, but I don't expect it with these. They're two private entities agreeing on something, and there's a public good aspect to it, right? So if the payer doesn't, if they're getting some advantage of it, they don't want to make that publicly known. So there's reasons why they try, and certainly the payer, the manufacturer doesn't want to tell everybody what the discount is in that group or what the agreement was.
Just going off that, if it's just a Medicare and Medicaid, is that going to become more public?
I would think so.
Okay.
If it becomes outside of the context of that, there would definitely, I would expect there to be more transparency in that. And it is a real missed opportunity to get at effectiveness data. I mean, they're collecting these measures. It's important for patient safety. I mean, there's a sort of public health issue
And if CMS is paying for it, that should be available.
Right, but companies aren't sharing it now because it kind of gives them a competitive edge.
Yeah, it's just the nature of they want to basically deal with each individual payer and maximize that relationship and not have it compromise other stuff. You can imagine some other risks that might come up, right? If they're tracking patients, you might find a safety signal that you didn't want, or you might find stuff that, if it's not doing as well in the local environment, you don't want that spread, right? They want control over that kind of messaging stuff. So, and in that private negotiation, that private contract, they have a sense of control over that. So basically, this is a list of barriers. A lot of these are on the payer side, but basically, it takes a lot of additional effort. Traditional contracts, they just track the number of pills and they pay for that. Here, you have to collect the data. You have to create a system where you can collect the data. You have to communicate. You have to basically adjudicate the claims. Sometimes they involve third parties where they send all their data to somebody and they do the data crunching. So there's a lot of effort. You have to have the infrastructure to be able to do that. So not everybody has adequate infrastructure to be able to collect the types of data that inform these types of agreements. Medicaid best price. I can talk a little bit more about this, but this is a pretty central issue. I think I only have a couple more minutes. But Medicaid best price is a big issue because manufacturers are required to give Medicaid their best price that they give to any other group. Okay, there are a few groups that are exempt from that. I don't think they have to do that with the VA. But by and large, if they give the best price to any individual payer, they have to give that to Medicaid. And so through one of these agreements, they give a lower price than they were already giving. So that now becomes their new best price. They would have to offer that to every Medicaid program in the entire U.S. with some serious consequences to that. So this is an issue with this. You can imagine even with small sample size, that's a particular issue, right? You have 50 patients, and just by variability in patients, all of a sudden you have to give 40 rebates. Now your price is severely dropped, and now your best price drops, and so they worry about that one a lot, and they typically write language to try and deal with that, but there's not real clarity on the full implications of Medicaid best price, and it's one of the areas that I was talking about in terms of a barrier that if they deal with that legislatively, then you will see more of these and have a different variety. So the real remaining legislative ones are Medicaid best price and communicating off-label, because you might want to do a full cost of care type model. You might want to do something that's off-label but important. But they can't have these agreements. They won't do that now. So that limits the types of agreements you can do. And there's some stuff around anti-kickback legislation, but I don't think that's quite as big of an issue. Okay. So here's just some key considerations. Good, I'm at about the right time. How do I jump back? That way. Okay, so basically the key considerations and challenges, it requires a lot of leadership at the top level of these organizations, a commitment to do them. If you don't get people who are willing to sign off at the upper levels, they're just not going to happen. So for it to be able to happen, you need leadership commitment. In terms of selecting medicines, you want clearly defined outcomes, so there's not a lot of ambiguity about whether that clinical endpoint matters or not. Short time frame, there's short agreements, 1 year, 2 year. You can't have things that are way in the future. You want to be able to get them easily, so most of them are based on claims data, sometimes EMR data if that group has it, and sometimes the quality measures that are already being collected. And you want to be able to reliably measure that. A lot of wrangling about definitions and metrics that are used in these, so that's just negotiation back and forth. Data issues, quality of data, and then all this stuff about government regulation. So those are the key fundamental things that you need to consider when you do this. And so just by way of conclusion, there's a sort of in line with larger trends trying to move towards value-based agreements. There are a lot of barriers to getting them done, especially in the US. And these are not going to apply to all medical products, but only ones where it's sort of a win-win for the manufacturer. The manufacturer is willing to sit down, the payer is willing to sit down, and they're willing to hash out an agreement to try it. So it's not for all products, but it is increasingly becoming a viable option for reimbursement in the US. So I did want to leave some time for questions, but I think we might get.
I have a little time for
okay.
questions.
So my first question is VA is doing this, right?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think we have any VA agreements yet. So we've heard the VA doing it.
but I haven't been able to capture what the VA is.
Okay.
But if you know of one,
Katie, she's the VA.
yeah, you know of
I do
it.
research.
Yeah, I remember hearing about one a couple years ago, but we just couldn't track it down. So if you can say anything publicly, I would love to hear exactly what it is.
And my next question is, has any of this impacted the way pharmaceutical companies design their clinical trials? So for example, instead of doing like non-inferiority design, are they changing that trend to do more superiority?
Not that I haven't. I haven't heard that in our sort of discussions with manufacturers that it goes that far down the line. This is mostly something that shows up on the market access person's desk, and they say, "Do you do one of these? Let's do one." That's it. There's less sort of strategic planning all the way through. Where I would see it probably show up more in trying to get the indication right, so that you might be able to have one of these which may go all the way back to the clinical trial program, but I haven't seen it to that.
Are you aware, I'm sure they wouldn't share it publicly, but anecdotally on the payer side, particularly like the Cignas and the Harvard Pilgrims who do multiple of these, trying to take an arrangement from one product and use it as a leverage point on a competitor product?
Yeah.
So I know a lot of these are first-in-class, new drugs, new mechanisms, things like that, but I would imagine not all of them are.
No, they're not all. And so I've heard a little bit about that type of thing, but a little bit more in terms of it actually restricts what they're able to do with people who may come with a second product. So for example, if the agreement says, we'll do this, but you have to give us preferred formulary position, and then the competitor comes along and says, we want to do one, we'll give you a better deal, but you've already made the one that gives a better formulary position. So it kind of gets a little bit of but that may change in sort of the next version, the next round of negotiation. So you can see that there's certainly a back and forth with that. Yeah.
I don't know if this is totally related, but there's some discussion around reimbursement based on indication, differential pricing based on indication. Can you just share your views on that, whether it's viable and if that's being implemented at all?
Yeah, so part of that question is, so this is actually a way to get at indication-based pricing, a little bit. Because if the clinical measures are different by indication, you're going to get actually the value you're going to get in each indication is going to be different. So we actually just wrote a paper that compared this, this is a way to get at a differential price. You don't necessarily know what the value is, but you can see that you're getting closer to what the value-based price you might want to get. So indication-based pricing, I think, is an interesting way it's a good goal. What are you going to base that negotiation on? Are you going to base it on trials that you've observed? Like, what's the outcome measure that you're going to use to come out of indication-based price? You still have the issue with efficacy versus effectiveness. Now, one of the things you can think about these is it's actually very good to get at understanding of that drug in your population. So 2 years, once you've done one of these and you've collected all that data, you have a much better sense of how that drug operates in your population. That would be a great time to set up, well, moving forward, here's our new rebate. It's based on our understanding of a value we're trying to target. It's a negotiation. We understand how this drug works in our population. Now we're going to get close to what the assumed value. Now, getting at the indication piece is a little bit different because that also has to do with data systems and being able to track patients well enough to get different prices for different patients in different systems. So it's a little bit different in that way.
You have to link indication to the drug. That's the biggest difference.
Right, exactly. So you have to be able to create, and that's a data systems issue, and so some might be able to do it. I guess this is related to indication-based pricing, and you can use it to get closer. So we use the example in our paper of like Herceptin in pancreatic cancer. It's not quite indication, but it's different. It is in pancreatic versus breast cancer. And so if you have response as your measure, the value is different in those two. But you have response as your measure, and you're getting refunds for patients who do not respond in each setting. You have much more responders in the breast cancer setting versus the pancreatic setting, so the value is going to be different. You're getting a much bigger refund in one versus the other, and so you're going to get closer to an indication-based price. But
what about off-label then? Like that is almost eliminated?
Off-label?
Yeah.
In terms of these agreements?
Yeah.
Yeah. Pretty much. The way the data is crunched is mostly where in the contract.
The contract just defines the rebate, right? But the drugs are still covered for everyone, everyone's using it.
But it also covers the population.
Okay.
So because they have to collect data in a certain way with their systems, there's a lot of negotiation on what the protocol itself looks like and how they're going to get at that population.
That could lead to limiting off-label use.
Right, and then the question is, so sometimes what they will do is they will say, okay, we're going to take this relevant population that we can isolate well in our data, and we'll apply that discount to the whole population. Or the discount only applies to that population that we've identified. And again, that's a contractual negotiation. So when where it applies to everybody, then you might draw on the off-label side.
All right, well, thanks, Josh.